Our sermon reading today is Luke 21, verses 1 to 4. Here's what Luke writes for us. And as Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. Truly, I tell you, he said, this poor widow has put in more than all of the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. We're going to continue in our series, Money Matters series. And remember, I'm giving this series because this is about life, folks. God's purpose for us and the goal of this whole series is that we might be financially secure within our lives. We might get ourselves out of debt because every aspect of the gospel is about liberation from debt and the things that God does not want in our life so that we can live the full abundant life that God has for us. It's about us so that we can live generously with all that we have because we've been blessed with a purpose to live generously. And we started with what the most important part, the first one in the series was wholehearted devotion. It's about our wholehearted devotion to God, to God's kingdom, to God's principles of how we truly are called to live. Then last week we took a look at the idea of a commitment to reduce our debt because when we are out of debt, we can live more freely and give more freely to God's kingdom. And then today we're going to talk about faithfulness and the disciplined lifestyle. So I'm just going to start out this morning with a little joke because I think the pastor here looks a little like me when I had a little more hair, Pastor Tom here. And it says, Pastor Tom's practice of charging for church restrooms was not without controversy, but he had raised a tidy sum for the upcoming mission trips. Don't put it past me. I'll do anything if I think we need to raise money, and we'll do what we got to do. But the reality is, for many of us, our financial freedom and our generosity really doesn't depend on how much we have or make. Remember last week we talked about that. If we got more, what do? We spend more. That's how we are. That's what the culture tells us. If you get it, you spend it, spend it, spend it. So it's not about how much we have or make so much. It's more about really financial freedom and generosity are the fruit of being faithful and disciplined with what God has entrusted to us. See, it's not the million. What would happen if I had $1 million? If $1 million were my lot, or if you play Powerball, $700 million were my lot, right? But it's what am I doing with the $10 that I've got? And between services, we talked about some things, and we talked about if we could each give $10 more a week, the impact that would have for our church and the power that would take place. $10 can make all the difference in the world. $10. Now, today we're going to be looking again, like I said, at the discipline, practice, and faithfulness to God's principles. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7 tells this to Timothy in advice. He says, we have not been given a spirit of timidity or fear, but we've been given a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. Did you know you have a spirit of self-discipline within you? That we can live a disciplined lifestyle by the power of God to help us do the things that we are called to do. So today, here's number one goal. To understand God's view of wealth and finances. Last week I talked the culture's view, which was earn all you can, spend all you can, repay all you can, maybe try and save something up for the future, and if anything's left over at the end of the week, then maybe I can try and help and live generously and give. But you see, God's view of finances is very different than that. Here's where it starts. I think Deuteronomy 8:18 tells it perfectly for us. In Deuteronomy 8:18, here's what Moses writes for us. He says, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant. It's he who gives you the ability to work and to produce wealth. We are called to earn with good, honest, hard, balanced work. That's what God calls for us to do. God has given us work and the ability to produce wealth. Our contribution of work is how God provides for our needs. It's how God provides for our family's needs. It's how God builds our self-esteem so often. It's a sense of well-being and purpose when we're working because God has given us work. Anybody, what do you think about that? It's all right. I think work is good. Remember from the very beginning, creation itself, what does God say? God was at work and then he rested. Jesus, John chapter 5 tells us, my Father is even at work today in the work of redemption and all the things that are going on. Look at Adam. And Adam was put to work immediately within the garden. It wasn't like after the fall, it's like, oh, wow, now the curse of sin brought work into the work. Great. Work was always there because it's important. It's what God has for us. Able-bodied, able-minded people are called to work. The second thing is this, 1 Corinthians 16:2, and I believe this is what God speaks for us. Paul writes, on the first day of the week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, and then being able to give it. I truly believe this. What God tells us is first things first. See, at the first part of the week, save up money according to your wealth so that we're able to give it. Because if you're waiting till you buy all you can, try and repay all you can, try and save all you can, what's at the end? Nothing. But if we do it first, and it's the most amazing thing, and I'll talk about this a little later too, that when you work by God's principles, God blesses and increases. And it doesn't look like it should work that way, and yet it does. So I truly believe God calls us to work, and God calls us to give back first. Then God calls us to plan ahead. Proverbs 6:6-8 says this, go to the ant, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander or overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and then gathers its food in the harvest. You see, the ant plans ahead for what's coming. I believe God calls us to plan ahead too. Now, the Bible never tells us to stockpile or save out of fear. That's not the goal. But we're supposed to look forward and plan accordingly. Farmers, not anymore necessarily, but in the old times, they would have to save back seeds, right? Because they had something to plant next year. They had to save back. They thought ahead. That was the idea. Remember Joseph, when he was brought over into Egypt, God showed him in a dream there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of very lean, hard times. During the 7 years of plenty, save some back. Why? Because in the 7 years of lean, you can then use it. I believe God calls us to plan ahead, to look ahead, and to save. Number 4, I think this is what God asks of us all the time, and this is very important. Repay. If we have debt, we repay it. Pay back all that we owe. Let no debt remain outstanding, Paul says, Romans 13:8, except for the debt of love. We talked about that last week, which we could never pay back. And finally, I think this is the whole purpose and principle of it. We are called to enjoy life. Anybody here enjoy life? We're called to enjoy it. It's a good thing. God's principles for financial health bring enjoyment. God's plan is that we're financially secure, we have freedom, then we're able to be fruitful and live generously and share and give and be free from debt and have all these wonderful things. And this is what Paul writes to Timothy. Command those who are rich in the present world not to be arrogant, put their hope or trust in wealth, which is uncertain. Put your hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. That's what we're here for. We're to enjoy life and the true abundant life that God has for us. So number 1, there's God's plan that we can begin to think about. Now, how do we get to this place? We get there because we discipline our lives and we are faithful stewards of what God has entrusted to us. Now, I've already said amounts are not the issue. I mean, I know people that they make 2x, 3 times as much money as me. They are not financially secure and then are not able to live generously because the more we make, what do we do with it? We spend it. We go into debt more with it. That's a cycle we want to break if we want to live generously by God's plan. See, God doesn't judge by amounts, but God looks for faithfulness with what has been entrusted to us. Because giving's not a competition. It's always about me. You see, the idea is you don't look around to other people and go, well, what are they giving? I think I'm giving more than that. That's not the issue here. The issue is this right here. I always tell us this, right? I tell you, this person right here, this is the person you got to worry about, okay? It's you. Don't worry about everybody else. You're called to faithfulness to God. God's not going to judge you based upon what somebody else did. He's going to look at your life and say, what did you do with what I blessed you with and encouraged you with? What did you do with what I entrusted to you? That's the one we got to look out for. You know, it's interesting. It's not about amounts. You know, the average giving today for Christians is 2.5% of their income. Compare that to during the Great Depression, where the average giving was 3.3% of the income. Now, what does that tell us? It's not about amounts, it's about the heart and where we are. So here we have this scripture for us today, Luke 21, verses 1 through 4. I know a lot of you have heard this message before, or at least what this is about this poor widow who puts money into the offering. But if you go back to the end of chapter 20, and this is important for us to get, the last handful of verses of chapter 20, here's what Luke writes for us. Jesus looked out and he saw the religious leaders, and he said, beware of those people. Really, beware of their whole system. He says, oh, they love the wealth that they have. They love all the honor that they get. And they walk around in their long flowing robes. And everybody looks at them and thinks they're so special. And then he throws this little phrase in there. He says, and they devour widows' homes. And then they have long, showy prayers to kind of say how great they are. And immediately from right there, we get chapter 21 where Jesus looks up and says, now look at all the people putting money in here. You see, Luke wants us to connect those two things together. So they look up, and Jesus says, look at all the people giving money, and they're dropping in. The wealthy are coming and putting money in there. It's no sacrifice, really, for them. They're just doing it. They're giving money out of their wealth. It's not a really big deal. And then a poor widow comes in, and in their culture, a widow was very vulnerable, and most often in poverty, okay? So this widow comes, and she gives 2 small copper coins, which literally is a fraction of a day laborer's daily wage, okay? I mean, this is a small amount. She puts the money in, and Jesus immediately says, look at that. She put in more than all the others. And they got to look at Jesus and go, Jesus, I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And I know I at least passed grade school math. She did not put in more than anybody else, right? But Jesus says it's not about amounts, is it? It's about devotion. It's about your heart. It's about understanding what God has blessed you with and entrusted to you and what you give back in your faithfulness. Not amounts. You see, the wealthy people, they threw in a little bit. It was no sacrifice for them to throw a little bit in. It was no big deal. But for her, she put in everything she had to live on. 2 things I want to say. I think Jesus is commending her that she has devotion and that she is pouring herself out in sacrifice and faithfulness. Yes, it was a small amount. But I think Jesus is also giving a condemnation to a system that, according to him, takes a poor widow in poverty and vulnerable, devours widows' homes, and then devours their livelihood in the process. Eek. We have to remember what we're here for. We're here to care for those who are vulnerable. We're here to care for those. That's why we exist. Because for God, it's not simply about resources. It's about our hearts and our obedience and our faithfulness. And that's what we will be rewarded upon. Because God is very concerned about our attitudes and responsibilities towards wealth and possessions because it reveals something. You know what it reveals? Our spiritual maturity. It reveals where we place our trust, where we place our security, where our allegiance is, where our devotion is. A couple weeks ago, I talked to you about Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. Remember, a talent is a unit of money, a measurement of money. And the master goes away, and he hands out to the servants. He says, here, you get 5 talents, you get 2 talents, you get 1 talent. We know the story. He says, go do business, man. Go make a profit with what I'm giving you. I'm blessing you with all this stuff. The one with 5 goes back and gets 5 more. The one with 2 gets 2 more. The one with 1 is scared, so he buries it. And Jesus, of course, tells him, you wicked, lazy servant, what are you doing? You know, at least get interest out of it from a bank. You got to take what I've given you and do something faithful and positive with it. But here's what I want you to see in the story. Yes, it's about stewardship, but notice he gave different amounts to different people. So it's not about amounts. It's about faithfulness to what's been given to me. If I've been given 2 talents of money, I'm not expected to return what the person with 5 talents did, but I better get more than the one with 1. It's about faithfulness to what God has blessed me with, because reward is based on faithfulness. Equality is about proper return for what's been entrusted to me, not necessarily just amounts. Because each person's work and return is really giving an offering and a sacrifice back to God of who we are. So my question today is, are you being faithful? Are you being faithful with what God has entrusted to you? Are you being disciplined with what God has trusted to you? Are you being a good steward? So how are we going to get to this point of being faithful? How are we going to get to this point of being disciplined in our lives? Well, I didn't come up with this. Someone else did, so don't think I'm trying to say this is mine. But it's called the 10-5-85 plan. I think first, the 10% tithe is perfect. It's fair. It's not arbitrary. God says, this is what I want you to give back first. Second, I think setting aside 5% for future planning, for savings, for seed money, whatever that is, that's a good thing. And then take 85%, and that's what we live on. We live under our means. Remember, over 50% in America of the people, households, they spend more than they make every year, okay? It's really hard to live under your means when you're spending more than you bring in. It's about a disciplined practice where we can be faithful with God, what He's entrusted to us. It's living with those godly principles. So how am I going to become more disciplined and faithful so that I can do something like this and be a blessing and live really generously? Here's one thing, I think. The first one is do the right thing. Planned giving to God. Planned giving to God's kingdom. Kathy and I, when we first were married, this is a choice we made. We said we are going to put the tithe in just in our budget, just like every other bill we have. And we stuck to it. And God has always taken care of us, because I'm telling you, there were times where we were poor, man. And God took care of us because we were faithful. And it doesn't make sense, and I'll talk about tithing in a couple weeks here, but it doesn't make sense to say I'm giving 10% to God first. There's no way I can have more money at the end of the month, and somehow at the end of the month we had more money than what we had before we were tithing. I don't understand it. But you see, God's principles, that's how God does things. God says when you put first things first, other things aren't suppressed, but they are increased, because that's the way God has planned it and what God wants for us in our lives. Number two, I think we should try, maybe you can try this, try budgeting over lump sum living. Anybody here lump sum live? You just throw all your money in an account and you just pay bills to, and then hopefully you have enough at the end to pay for everything. And you're like, I don't know where it all goes, but it's here. Maybe try, okay, let's get sectors. Let's allot money for sectors. Let's see where all that money goes. And don't forget, if you're going to do this, things like entertainment and vacations and gift buying, those are important things too. Come Christmas time and you go, ooh, I forgot to say I need to buy presents. That's not a good thing. Here's one thing that goes along with that. You want to know where your money goes? Take a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a month. Keep every single receipt that you have. Every one you get, you keep it. Oh, I know. Pay something online, print off thing. At the end of the month, you'll know exactly where all your money's going. I know I don't want to do that, because I don't want to know where all my money's going all the time. It's like, if you want to know, there it is. Keep your receipts. Maybe cheapen out the everyday. Eliminate non-needed services. Get the best rates for services. Cell phones, banks, satellite, cable, insurances, subscriptions, like I've said a couple times today. Do we have to have Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon Prime to watch TV? Maybe we can get rid of a couple of those things, and then $10, $15, $20 a month. Maybe, I never watch HBO, but I pay $20 a month for it. Do I really need that? Cheapen out the everyday. We can do that. What can you do without? Perform a little plastic surgery. That's always a good one. Cut a few cards. Take on no new debt. Stop living beyond your means. Experts in this say if your debt ratio is 50% of your income going towards paying off debt or beyond, you could be in trouble. Set future goals. Make a wish list. Plan for special buys. It feels good to save and pay cash. This thing called delayed gratification instead of immediate gratification. If you have money for it, see if they'll give you 180 days, same as cash. See if you can pay it off without using that money. Then you still got your money left. Keep your financial freedom. I read the story in a book here of a gentleman who wanted a Harley. He waited 10 years saving up money to buy that Harley. Delayed gratification. He said, I wasn't going to go in debt for it. Man, it's so great to have that thing debt-free. It's about impulse control. I call it the 48-hour rule. If you think you got to have it and buy it, wait 48 hours and think about it and pray about it and see if it really is something you got to have, because we're impulse. Maybe delay it. see what's there. Finally, nurture an attitude of gratitude. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. Be joyful always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances. Pray and thank God for the blessings he gives us, for the principles that we can live by. See, it's a commitment to contentment within our lives, to be grateful and to have that gratitude. I know most of the times in our lives, there's the gratitude department and the complaints department, and you know where we're always going. The gratitude department is where we should be. Anne Frank put it this way: no one has ever become poor by giving. Think about it. No one has ever become poor by giving. So finally this week, as we close this up, we're looking at that whole idea of being faithful stewards, of being disciplined with our life. Would you pray this week? Would you see about committing to a regular giving? Plan on dealing with your debt, establishing a budget, whatever that thing might be, to get into our place where we can be secure financially, set free the way God wants us to, and to be able to live generously the way God wants us to live, and to be all that we can be in a financially healthy situation. So what's God asking of you? What steps will you take today to be disciplined and faithful with what God has entrusted to you, and be thankful for it?